The day my daughter-in-law had our first grandchild, I sat in a waiting room holding a cup of cold coffee for 3 hours, while every single member of her family walked in and out of that delivery suite like it was a revolving door. My wife held my hand. We didn't say anything to each other. We didn't need to. What happened after is something I still turn over in my mind late at night, usually around 2 in the morning when the house is quiet and there's nothing left to distract me from it. My name doesn't matter much to this story. What matters is that I'm a 61-year-old man who spent 35 years building a contracting business from the ground up, raised one son, buried my own father without ever once asking him for a dime, and thought, genuinely believed, that I had done everything right. Not perfectly, but right. My son's name is Owen. He's 34. He got his mother's eyes and for a long time her patience. He's a civil engineer. Went to NC State on a partial scholarship, worked summers on job sites with me so he could cover the rest. I was proud of him in the specific, quiet way that fathers who don't say things out loud are proud. I still am. That part hasn't changed, even after everything. He met Claudia at a work conference in Charlotte about 4 years ago. She works in commercial real estate, leasing, high-end mixed-use developments, the kind of deals that get written up in local business journals. She's sharp, I'll give her that. She could read a room faster than almost anyone I'd ever met, which, as it turns out, is a skill that cuts both ways. The first time Owen brought her home for dinner, she complimented the house, and then asked how long we'd owned it in the same breath. Not rude exactly, but noted. My wife, Loretta, made her pot roast with the little carrots and the gravy she does from scratch, and Claudia said it was really homey, which is the kind of compliment that isn't quite one. Loretta smiled and said thank you. I watched my wife smile and say thank you, and I filed that moment away without knowing why. The engagement was quick. 14 months after they met, Owen called me from Claudia's apartment, and I could hear the smile in his voice before he even said the words. I told him I was happy for him. I meant it. I told him she was lucky to have him. I meant that too. The wedding planning was when things started to shift. Not dramatically, not all at once. More like the way a house settles. You don't notice it until you see a crack in the drywall and realize it's been spreading for years. Claudia's parents live in Raleigh. Her father, Raymond, is a former investment banker. Her mother, Sylvia, has never worked a day in her adult life as far as I can tell. But she has opinions about floral arrangements that she delivers with the conviction of someone giving closing arguments. They offered to pay for the wedding. Owen and I talked about it. He said it would mean a lot to Claudia, that her parents had always imagined hosting something like this. I said fine. What I meant was, I understand what you're telling me. What I didn't understand, not yet, was that paying for something, in Claudia's world, meant owning it completely. The guest list became a negotiation. We were given 40 slots. Raymond and Sylvia had 210. I have a big family, brothers, cousins, people who showed up with casseroles when my mother passed, and who have known Owen since he was in a stroller. We ended up with 32 slots after Claudia explained that the venue had a capacity concern. The venue held 400 people. I did not say this out loud. Loretta's sister had to be cut. We told her there wasn't room. She understood, but her eyes said otherwise, and I still think about that. At the rehearsal dinner, Claudia's family occupied one long table that ran the length of the private dining room at the steakhouse they'd chosen downtown. We were at a round table near the back with Owen's college friends. I sat next to Loretta and made conversation and told myself this was normal, that merging families was always awkward, that I was being too sensitive. Owen gave a toast. He thanked Raymond and Sylvia first for their generosity. Then he thanked his groomsmen. Then he said, and of course my parents, and raised his glass in our direction before moving on. My wife put her hand on my knee under the table. I don't know if she was steadying herself or me. The wedding day itself was beautiful, and I say that without sarcasm. The venue was a restored mill about 40 minutes outside Charlotte. String lights, big floral arches, the whole thing. Owen looked like himself in his tuxedo, which surprised me. Some men disappear inside formal clothes, and some just look like themselves with better fabric. He looked like my son. I held on to that. I walked Loretta to our seats. Front row, groom's side, which was right. Everything was right on the surface. The ceremony was perfect. Owen cried a little at the altar when Claudia came down the aisle, and I thought, that's my boy. Whatever else, that's still my boy. The reception was where it started. They'd seated us at a table that was technically close to the front, but angled in a way where we couldn't see the head table directly. You had to turn in your chair. A small thing. Loretta didn't mention it. I noticed she didn't mention it, which told me she'd noticed it too. During dinner, I got up to find Owen and congratulate him properly, man to man, the way you do when the speeches are over and the night belongs to everyone. He was at the bar with three of his college friends, loose and tie, laughing at something. When he saw me, he grinned and grabbed my shoulder, and I hugged him, really hugged him, and told him I loved him, and he said, "Love you too, Dad," and it was real. I know it was real because I know my son. I was walking back to our table when it happened. Claudia was standing near the edge of the dance floor with two of her bridesmaids. Loretta had gone to say hello. My wife, who had sat through that rehearsal dinner with Grace, who had cut her own sister from the guest list without complaint, who had driven 40 minutes in her nicest dress to celebrate this woman's marriage to our son, walked over to congratulate her daughter-in-law on her wedding day. I was maybe 15 feet away. I saw it happen in the way you see a car accident. Too fast to stop, slow enough to remember every detail. Claudia turned. Her expression changed. I have tried to describe what I saw in her face, and the closest I can get is inconvenience. Like Loretta had walked up and reminded her of something unpleasant. She said loud enough that the two bridesmaids went still. "I need you to stop hovering. You've been doing it all day. Nobody asked you to be here managing things. This is my wedding, mine, so do us both a favor and go sit down and stay there." Loretta didn't move for a moment. She's not a small woman emotionally. She's the kind of person who fills a room without trying. But in that moment, she seemed to get very quiet inside herself. Like something had been turned off. She said softly, "I just wanted to say congratulations." Claudia said, "I heard you the first time." Then she turned back to her bridesmaids. I had reached Loretta by then. I put my hand on her back and I guided her away from that spot and back toward our table. She didn't cry. That was the thing that wrecked me most. She didn't cry, she just walked, and her face was very still. I sat down next to her and I covered her hand with mine, and I thought very carefully about what I was going to do next. I want to be honest about that moment, because I've had people tell me afterward that I should have walked back over there and said something in front of everyone, made a scene, defended my wife publicly the way she deserved to be defended. And maybe they're right. But I looked at Owen across that room, still laughing at the bar, and I thought, if I do that, I will blow up his wedding night, and he will spend the rest of his life with a photograph in his head of his father causing a scene at his reception. I didn't want to give Claudia's family that story. I didn't want to become the difficult in-laws that justified everything she'd ever said about us. So I held Loretta's hand, and I stayed calm, and I made a decision I didn't announce to anyone. We left after the cake cutting, politely. Owen came to find us, and I told him we were tired, and it was a long drive, and he hugged Loretta and said he was glad she was there. She told him she loved him. Neither of us told him what had happened. In the car, about 20 minutes into the drive home, Loretta said, "She did that on purpose." I said, "I know," she said. "She wanted people to see it." I said, "I know that too." Then she said quietly, looking out at the road, "What are we going to do?" And I said, "Nothing yet." Owen called us the next day from the airport, heading to St. Lucia for the honeymoon. He sounded happy. I told him to have a wonderful time. I meant it. The anger I felt was not at Owen, exactly. It was more complicated than that. It was the kind of anger that has grief inside it. We didn't hear much from them for the first 2 months after they got back. A text here and there. We saw Owen once for lunch, just the two of us, and he seemed fine, present like himself. I almost brought up the wedding. I decided not to. I wanted him to come to it. Loretta and I talked about it at the kitchen table one night, with decaf and the overhead light on, which is when we have our serious conversations. She said she could forgive Claudia. She said she didn't want to lose her son. I said I didn't either. I said there was a difference between forgiving something and pretending it hadn't happened, and that I wasn't willing to spend the next 30 years teaching Claudia that this kind of behavior had no consequence. Loretta said, "So what does a consequence look like?" I said I wasn't sure yet, but I would figure it out. Here's what most people don't know about me. I'm not a loud person. Never have been. I don't yell. I don't send emails in all caps. I built a business in an industry where your reputation is the only currency that actually matters, and you don't protect a reputation by making noise. You protect it by being steady, and then, when the moment comes, being immovable. So I was patient. Claudia and Owen announced the pregnancy 6 months after the wedding. We found out from a group text that included Sylvia and Raymond and 3 of Claudia's cousins. The text had a photo of a positive test. Loretta screenshotted it immediately. I could see how happy she was, and I felt something loosen slightly in my chest. Whatever happened, whoever Claudia was, this was still our grandchild. We sent flowers. Claudia texted a thank you emoji. As the pregnancy progressed, Loretta started asking about the birth plan. Not invasively, just the way any mother would. Would they want family at the hospital? Was Claudia planning on a particular room or birth center? What could we do to help in those first weeks? She asked these questions through Owen, carefully, because she had learned that direct contact with Claudia produced delayed or minimal responses. Owen said they'd let us know. Loretta said that was fine. She started buying things: a crib, receiving blankets, a white noise machine she'd read about, and stacking them in the spare room. Every time I passed that room, I thought about the wedding. About how my wife had walked toward her daughter-in-law with nothing but goodwill and been turned away like a solicitor. The baby's due date was in March. In January, Owen called me, not Loretta, me, and explained that Claudia had decided she wanted to keep the birth very private. Immediate family only, meaning her parents. They would call us when the baby arrived, and we could come visit the next day or whenever worked. I asked Owen directly, "Does that mean we're not coming to the hospital?" He said, "Claudia just feels like the labor process is really personal. Her mom is going to be there just for support." I said, "Okay." And then I said, "I want you to understand that I'm going to remember this moment, not to hold it over you, just so you know that I remember." He went quiet. Then he said, "Dad, it's just how she wants it." I said, "I know, I heard you. We'll be here when you call." I hung up the phone and sat in my truck in the driveway for a long time. The night Claudia went into labor, we got a text from Owen at 11:47 p.m. that said, "It's happening, we'll update you." Loretta stayed up. I stayed up. We sat in the living room with the TV on low, and neither of us watched it. At 6:14 a.m., Owen sent a photo. A tiny red face, wrapped in one of those hospital blankets with the pink and blue stripes. A name underneath. Milo James. Loretta made a sound I had never heard from her before. Something between a laugh and something that wasn't a laugh. I stared at the photo of my grandson and I thought, there it is, there he is. He's here and he's healthy, and that's the thing that matters most. We texted back immediately. We called Owen, who sounded exhausted and happy, and like a father, which he now was. He said Claudia was resting. He said Milo was 7 pounds 4 ounces. He said the NICU team had checked him out and everything was perfect. I told him I was proud of him. I told him to sleep when he could. Then I said, "When can we come?" He said he'd let us know. We waited 2 days. Loretta organized the nursery at our house. I fixed the railing on the back porch that had been loose for a year because I'd been meaning to do it before the baby started walking. Somewhere around day 2, I realized I was doing projects to keep from looking at my phone. On the 3rd day, Owen texted, "You can come tomorrow if you want," around noon. We arrived at their house, a 3-bedroom colonial in a nice neighborhood about 25 minutes from us that we had co-signed the mortgage on 4 years prior, before the wedding, before any of this, and Claudia's parents were already there. Already there, with what looked like 2 days of their things in the guest room. Loretta held Milo, and it was the first time I'd seen her fully happy in months. The kind of happy that takes over your whole face, without you noticing. She rocked him in the glider we had bought them, the one from the registry, the expensive one she'd driven to 3 stores to see in person, and she whispered to him, and I watched my wife be a grandmother, and that part was exactly what I had hoped it would be. But Raymond sat at the kitchen table like a man who owned the place, which, in the way that mattered in that room, he did. He and Owen talked about the Hornets game. Sylvia hovered near Claudia on the couch, refilling her water, adjusting her pillow, doing all the things that Loretta had come to do, and had arrived too late to begin. We stayed for about 2 hours. On the way out, Claudia said goodbye to us with the specific warmth of someone who has already said goodbye in her head before you got there. In the car, Loretta said, "She's never going to let me in." I said, "No, she isn't." Loretta said, "Then what do we do?" I looked at the house through the windshield. The house I had co-signed for, the house with my grandson inside it. The house where my wife had just held a baby in a glider she had driven to 3 stores to pick out. And I said, "We stop pretending that none of this is happening. And then I make 1 phone call." She looked at me. "To who?" "My attorney." "I want to explain something before you decide what you think of that. I had never threatened my son, never used money or property as a lever. That is not the man I was raised to be, and it is not the father I tried to become. But there is a thing that happens when you watch someone you love be diminished again and again by a person who has calculated, and I believe it was calculated, that there will be no cost to it. Claudia had understood from early on that we needed Owen more than he needed us, in the transactional sense, that we would absorb almost anything to keep from losing him. She was not wrong about this. What she miscalculated was how long patience can look like surrender before it stops being either. The cosign on Owen's mortgage was not a small thing. I had put my name and my credit on a $480,000 loan. At the time, Owen's income was sufficient, but his debt-to-income ratio was too high from his student loans, and the bank required a cosigner. I signed because he was my son, and because Loretta wanted him to have a good home, and because I believe that family takes care of family. I had never once brought it up after the day we left the title company. I called my attorney, a man I've used for business contracts for 15 years, smart, no nonsense from Greensboro, and I told him the situation, not the emotional parts, just the facts. I was a co-signer on a mortgage. I was the co-owner of a business my son was partially involved in for tax purposes, and I needed to understand what my options were and what proper legal notice would look like if I needed to protect my own financial interest. He listened. He asked a few questions. Then he said, "You want to restructure or you want to make a point?" I said, "I want to make a point clearly enough that it functions as a restructure." He said he'd draft something. 2 weeks later, Owen called me. Not a text, a call. He called at 7:30 on a Tuesday morning, which told me he'd been sitting on it since the night before. He said, "Dad, I got a letter from your attorney." I said, "I know." He said, "What is this?" I said, "It's a formal notice that I'm reviewing my financial exposure as a co-signer and co-business interest holder. It's something I should have done periodically regardless. I just hadn't gotten around to it." There was a long silence. He said, "Is this about Claudia?" I said, "Owen, this is about me being 61 years old and making sure my finances are in order. That's a reasonable thing for a man my age to do." Another silence, longer this time. He said, "Can we have dinner? The three of us. You, me, and Mom." I said, "Of course, you name the place." He took us to a quiet Italian restaurant on a Wednesday night, a place he and I had been to before, which was its own kind of signal, neutral ground that leaned toward our side. Claudia was not there. He hadn't mentioned that she wouldn't be, and I hadn't asked. We ordered. He talked for a while about work, about Milo, about how little sleep they were getting. Loretta asked questions about the baby, and her face was open and warm and real, because that is who she is even when she has been hurt. Then he put down his fork and he said, "Mom, I need to tell you something." She looked at him. He said, "I knew something happened at the wedding. I didn't know what. I didn't ask because I think I was afraid of what you'd tell me." He paused. "I'm asking now." Loretta looked at me. I nodded once. She told him. Quietly, without editorializing, the way she tells things. She told him what Claudia had said. She told him that she'd only walked over to say congratulations. She told him she hadn't cried that night because she hadn't wanted to ruin the drive home for me. Owen sat with it for a moment. His jaw was tight in the way it gets when he's holding something in. He said, "I'm sorry, Mom. I should have made sure you were okay. I should have noticed." She said, "You were getting married. I didn't want you to notice." He said, "That doesn't make it okay." She said, "No, it doesn't." There was something clarifying about hearing her say that plainly, not with anger, just with the simple truth of it. Owen talked to Claudia. I don't know exactly what was said between them. That's their marriage, not mine. But things shifted. Slowly, the way things actually shift in real families, not all at once like in the movies. Claudia called Loretta. Not to apologize exactly, it was more of a careful conversation, hedged, positioned, but she called. That was a thing she had never done voluntarily before. There were sessions with a family therapist. Owen suggested it, which told me something good about who he still was underneath everything. Claudia went, which told me she had understood, finally, that there were things in her life she could not manage with positioning alone. We were careful about expectations. Loretta and I talked about it, about not expecting a transformation, about being willing to accept incremental, about keeping the goal in front of us, which was Milo and Owen, and the possibility of something that actually functioned. I withdrew the attorney's review formally about 3 months later. I didn't announce it. I just had my attorney send a brief letter saying the review was complete and no action was being taken at this time. Owen texted me, "Thank you, Dad." Just that. I wrote back, "That's what family does." I meant it as a statement of what I hoped we were becoming. I think he understood it that way. 6 months after Milo was born, Claudia asked Loretta if she wanted to come to his first pediatric checkup. Not Sylvia, Loretta. She called on a Sunday afternoon and asked if she was free on Thursday. Loretta came into the kitchen afterward. She didn't say anything for a moment. She just stood there. I said, "What happened?" she said. She invited me to the doctor's appointment. I said, "Good." She said, "Is that enough? Is that enough to build on?" I thought about it. About the waiting room at the hospital. About the wedding and the rehearsal dinner and the guest list. About my wife holding cold coffee for 3 hours. About Owen's face across that Italian restaurant when he finally asked the question he'd been avoiding. I said, "It's a start, and starts are what you build from." She nodded. She turned back to the counter and started on dinner. I watched her for a moment and I thought, we're still here, after all of it. We're still in this kitchen, still in this house, still in this family that is imperfect and ongoing and ours. Milo is going to grow up knowing who his grandfather is. He's going to come to this house and feel the way I felt in my grandfather's house, like the place itself remembers you. That's what I held out for. That's what the patience was for. Not revenge, not winning, just the right to still be present in my own son's life and in my grandson's, without having to disappear myself to earn it. Some things take time to become what they're supposed to be. I know, because I waited.